Hi guys, hope you're all doing well. Welcome to Novum. I know I already outlined what the next videos will be, but I caught Us last night and I'm a huge Jordan Peele fan, so just consider this a bonus video because I'm excited. The others are still coming. Now, because this is really new and because I can't dispute copyright strikes until I have 1,000 subs, I'm going to have to be very careful with what I show on screen, and for this reason I can't really break it down shot by shot. Rest assured, this will be extremely comprehensive though. All the different topic times are in the video description, so if you're just here for the Jeremiah verse or what's up with the scissors, you can go ahead and skip right to it. Lastly, before we get started, and I don't usually do this, but please be careful for spoilers from here on out. This is a movie you will likely enjoy more the less you know going in, so I strongly recommend watching it first and then coming back and checking out this video. Alright, let's get started. Now, out of necessity, we're going to break down the ending first, and then go back through and break down all the confusing moments, subtext, Easter eggs, all that good stuff. I'm guessing most of you saw the twist coming right from the Hall of Mirrors at the start, but let's make sure we're all on the same page before we get into the more complicated stuff. At the start of the movie, Adelaide wanders off from her parents and enters a funhouse on the pier that contains a Hall of Mirrors. In doing so, she unknowingly stumbles on a gateway to a subterranean complex that houses the results of an abandoned government experiment known as the Tethered. The Tethered are doppelgangers of the American public that were created in an attempt to control individual members of the public above them. They are described by Red, Adelaide's tethered counterpart, as puppets, and the marionette-like link seems to work better in reverse though, as for the most part the Tethered seem to be hostage to the desires of their above-ground counterparts rather than the other way around. This lack of control is likely what led to the abandonment of the project, and subsequently the abandonment of the Tethered themselves. At the end of the movie, we learn that when Adelaide encountered her doppelganger in the Hall of Mirrors at the start, she was overpowered by them and taken underground. Following this, the Tether twin takes Adelaide's place above ground, and is in fact the Adelaide that we have been following for the entire movie. Red, via the voice that dancing provides her, manages to earn a form of worship from the Tethered she resides with, and leads them in a violent revolution against their puppet masters. Her plan is to cut the tether that binds them at an individual level, and then have the Tethered form the Hands Across America. Although Red fails to overcome Adelaide at the end of the movie, she is successful in her plan of the Tethered forming the Hands Across America. In doing so, the implication is that they are finally standing up together in public and demanding to be counted. Now, one thing of note here, we will be referring to Red as the character Red is in the movie, but it's not entirely accurate to say that it was Red that kidnapped the original Adelaide. Red really only exists post-Adelaide's original kidnapping. In fact, it is likely Red that has named the Tethered around her, including herself. In all likelihood, the Adelaide we follow throughout the film likely had no name prior to her place switch. Hopefully all that isn't too confusing if you've seen the movie. In fact, I don't think this twist is necessarily supposed to be a twist for the audience. It's actually made explicitly clear beforehand that we're following the Tethered Adelaide throughout the movie, which we'll get to in a second. Instead, I think it's more prudent to consider it a twist for Adelaide herself, as she recalls the true horrors of her past that have been veiled by the trauma of her origins. Trauma plays a major part in informing Nyong'o's performance here, and a lot of people seem to be confused as to why she doesn't know she's originally a Tethered until the end. It's trauma, and it's actually very common in children that are subjected to terrifying situations or prolonged cruelty. Overall, it's really foreshadowed too heavily to be considered a twist for the audience. For me, the twist comes in the form of her personal realization and her ultimate lack of care in the face of self-preservation and familial survival. So let's look at all the clues and foreshadowing that let you know ahead of time we're not dealing with OG Adelaide. By far the biggest clue comes in the character's language. Following the switch of OG Adelaide, who we'll just call Red now for simplicity, Adelaide stops speaking, supposedly due to the trauma created by her disappearance. In reality, this is because she has never spoken before, save for the guttural moans we hear the Tethered produce. This is mirrored in her doppelganger Red being the only Tethered that can talk, or more accurately, the only one that speaks English. As Red, Nyong'o's voice is croaky, at first giving the impression of something demonic or otherworldly. In reality, though, it seems like she is basing the performance on people who have not spoken in a long time. Her vocabulary and understanding of context are well developed, but speaking itself seems to be a croaky and pained act, like a car attempting to start after collecting dust for decades. This is again another clue that Red is Adelaide, as she hasn't had to use her voice in the underground world of the Tethered. I actually saw Lupita Nyong'o confirm this theory, suggesting she based the voice in part on Robert Kennedy. The communication between tethered is highly reminiscent of language in feral children, especially when paired with the hand signalling and their scuttling gait as they move on all fours. Again, this first gives the impression of something demonic until the disenfranchised and underdeveloped nature of the tethered is made explicit, and in many, if not most ways, they become sympathetic figures. This language acquisition is an important beat in the movie because it demonstrates tethered and human as the same, just with a difference in opportunity. Adelaide doesn't seem soulless as they do, even though they are in fact one and the same. Adelaide comes from the world of the tethered. We'll go over this in a lot more detail, but really it's drawing the very clear parallel that even though other unknown groups are often found to be intimidating, we're all the same underneath. The difference maker is nurture, how we've been treated by society, and the tethered have been treated very poorly by society. Further foreshadowing of Red being the original Adelaide comes in the form of her desire to keep fake Adelaide tethered. Adelaide is handcuffed by Red upon their meeting, and she remains tethered throughout the movie until she finally kills her doppelganger and is subsequently able to break free of the physical tether of the cuffs. Another clue comes in the form of Adelaide's tendency to revert to her croaky, tethered feral sounds when she commits acts of violence. This actually becomes more noticeable as the film continues, until it is almost patently obvious during the final conflict and her murder of Red. The shadowed fight scene in the tiled corridor during the climax again alludes to the twist. Both Adelaide and Red are cast in darkness and constantly switch positions, making it difficult to track which is which as they change places fluidly. Honestly, the film is crammed full of Easter eggs and foreshadowing, letting the viewer know ahead of time. Gabe's concerned looks at Adelaide as her violence increases, camera work that constantly mirrors Adelaide and even acts as her reflection at points, shots of the back of Adelaide's head as she originally looked in the mirror at the funhouse, her watching her parents' conversation with the therapist via the angled reflection of a mirror, the therapist's indication to give Adelaide a voice through dance that is ultimately the catalyst for the tethered uprising. The list of foreshadowing is honestly pretty vast here, and I'd be interested to hear all the ones you guys spotted in the comments below. Again, I would suggest that it's better to view the whole thing as a twist intended for Adelaide. To me, the shock was that she didn't know. She'd blocked out the horror and trauma of her past, and in doing so lost the appreciation of once being disenfranchised herself. This is a potential example of cultural amnesia, forgetting the horrors of the past because your place in the now is comfortable. The idea of the tethered being the genuine victims of this situation is actually a pretty common sci-fi trope. A separate class, or species, or race are portrayed at first as barbaric or often demonic, but end up being the sympathetic victims of the ruling class, or at least the class or group that had first seemed virtuous. Star Trek Discovery did this recently with the Ba'ul and Kelpian races. Chronologically, I think The Time Machine by H.G. Wells would be where it first appeared with the conflict between Eloy and Morlocks. Black Mirror has done it, Ender's Game did it, Starship Troopers, the book at least, did it, Avatar definitely did it. I couldn't find specific terminology for this trope, so for now let's call it the Dances with Wolves device. It's perhaps most accurately described as post-colonial guilt. The realization that you aren't standing on the side of good. The realization that you are the bad guys. Post-colonialism and post-colonial study refer to art and academic work that focuses on the fallout and psychosocial effects of colonialism. That is to say, Western expansion during colonial times, the establishing of colonies, and the barbaric mistreatment and horrific assessments of the natives that resided there. That gave way to global slave trading and centuries of racial prejudice. Now, if you're Saru in Star Trek Discovery, or Kevin Costner in Dances with Wolves, or even Sam Worthington in Avatar, you may be inclined to turn that white guilt narrative into the widely known and widely criticized white savior archetype. I think the new Tarzan movie, or actually The Last Samurai, is a really great example of the white savior. Our white hero has to be on the side of successful and just morality, and subsequently joins the natives, causing him to lead them to unparalleled levels of success. Now, I did a lot of research on this, and apparently it's because during 80s, 90s, and early 2000s cinema, unless your name was John Shaft or Detective Murtaugh, the only thing beating a white man was another white man. And there's often a lot of cringeworthy cultural exposition involved in them joining the native populace, and in Avatar's case, even full-on species transplants. Ultimately, the whole thing is white fantasy attempting to erase the barbarism of the past. Sometimes it's done well and we get a good movie, and a lot of the time it's grossly offensive and lacking self-awareness. And one thing Us definitely isn't is white fantasy, and so it's interesting that Adelaide wants no part of any of this. Upon realizing her role as oppressor, she doesn't go give the tethered movement a leader with a voice. She doesn't want to go explain to the news the true nature of the tethered or her actions in her youth. She doesn't even desire to go stand with them in silent protest on the side of the oppressed. Instead, she looks at her family, and after overcoming the initial trauma of realization, she begins to laugh. Because she survived, because her family survived, and for once, everything feels like it's going to be okay. She may feel guilt momentarily, but it's certainly overwhelmed by her relief. Now, at first, that seems quite bleak in terms of what it says about the previously disenfranchised, but very true and very human at the same time. She escaped hell, and she's not about to climb back into it. However horrible that reality is, it also speaks to the truth that no one chooses to be disenfranchised or oppressed. That's insane. This is a coffin nail of reality being driven into the white savior archetype. But let's take it one step further, because that's still a little unsatisfying to me. Now, I will say that Us is far less concerned with issues of race than Get Out was. But make no mistake, it is still exemplary of black cinema, and as such, there are a few moments where we do receive commentary on the condition of Black America. Black Americans as a group have endured phenomenal injustices and violence against them and remain fearful, in parts at least, that they will continue to see more. This is a fear that often prevents protest and prevents conflict with authority or systemic powers wherever possible, out of continual reinforcement that they will be rendered the victim. A crushing resignation that taking on the struggles of others will exacerbate their own, as has historically been the case. In this situation, Adelaide and her family are safe, and considering all the threats from where she came and everything she's endured, that means a hell of a lot. Certainly more than saviour fantasies ever will. Now, I'm flashing up on screen some wonderful essays that will help you if you want to learn more about this stuff that I'm talking about, but one standout text, perhaps the defining text in the last decade of black literature, is Claudia Rankine's Citizen. It's extremely cool and completely heartbreaking all at the same time. Modernist poetry that you can sit down and read like a full book that concerns itself with primarily the kind of things I'm discussing here. Specifically an overall lack of optimism and a feeling of hopelessness from contemporary Black America as it continues to exist in a system that was originally constructed around its persecution. It speaks to frustration, anger, and mistreatment, and it's a text that everyone should read at least once. As with everything else I'm suggesting to you, you can find links in the video description. Before we move on, I'd just like to point out how closely linked Adelaide's resignation is here to just survive rather than to become the saviour, with Daniel Kaluuya's resignation at the end of Get Out. He doesn't cry foul or plead innocence when confronted with the blues and twos of the police car. He chokes back everything and assumes the position. He knows what the police are about to do, and it's the lack of optimism that he'd ever be considered the victim that is truly terrifying. That's pretty similar to what we see here with Adelaide, and ultimately a crushing rendition of the state of Black America. Now let's move on to something a little bit more salacious, something the movie does not make explicit. Does Jason know Adelaide is one of the tethered? More importantly, given that her children are technically half-tethered, does this have any further ramification? His troubled stare at Adelaide following the final conflict, and in the car ride at the end, seem to suggest he does know, or at least suspects her true nature. More troubling still is the picture he draws of the bloodied hobo that Adelaide finds. In it, he has his face turned away as Adelaide's tether twin does at the start of the movie. Adelaide is also shown like this frequently, even immediately following her finding the picture. She is filmed from the back of her head, with her face only visible in the reflection. It seems to be a pretty clear indicator that all is not right with Jason. During the initial break-in at their house, Jason's eyes seem to have the same harsh blue lighting as Adelaide's tether twin in the mirror at the start. While it remains unclear exactly what is going on with Jason, he does seem to be more closely linked with his tether twin Pluto than the rest of the family are with theirs. He can in fact control him directly, which leads to Pluto's self-immolation. There is maybe room for a second twist though. It's never confirmed, and I imagine it will be hotly debated, but there is potential that Jason is one of the tethered as well. He seems to have the strange eating habits the same as Adelaide. He has a rabbit sat on his lap during the final sequence, and when the girls on the beach ask him if he is building sandcastles, he replies, "No, I'm building sand tunnels." My favourite piece of evidence for this theory, though, is the burns on Pluto's face. Not only would this disfigurement give Adelaide a reason to return to the world of the tethered to swap a child out, it also provides an enigma. Would Pluto perhaps have known English too had his mouth not been so badly burned? It would also explain why he's capable with fire, whereas Jason seems unable to make the magic trick work and has to be shown how to click in a rhythm at the start of the movie. There are a couple of obvious problems with this theory though, namely that Red seems pretty sure it was her son Pluto that suffered in fire, and more importantly, how did this switch occur? If Adelaide made the switch following her son's disfigurement, then she would have known all along that she was tethered as well, which she doesn't. She clearly realizes that again at the end of the film. If Pluto and Jason switch places, then how? And why wouldn't the family be aware of the switch and the miraculous healing of their recently disfigured son? It's not a watertight theory, but it's fun to think about, and there is a lot of evidence towards its legitimacy. Now, before we end with examining deeper meaning, let's clear up a couple more confusing issues. Like, why doesn't Dahlia, that's the tether version of Kitty Tyler, why doesn't she kill Adelaide when she gets the chance to, and instead start cutting herself? Now, regular Kitty is vain and seemingly into plastic surgery, which, in line with how the tether relationship works, likely means that Dahlia was forced to do versions of those procedures on herself. Red is clearly a cult figure amongst the tethered, and Dahlia, mirroring Kitty's vanity, seeks to make herself look more like her. She traces the lines of Adelaide's face and is beginning to cut them into her own as she is interrupted. This may not be the only reason though. Although we see tethered attacking people that are not their doppelganger, we only ever see them try to kill the ones that are. This is likely because each murder is symbolic, violence of protest and transformation, and as such it seems to be the duty of each tethered to murder their corresponding doppelganger. Next up is that Jeremiah 11:11 quote, which reads, "Therefore thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will bring evil upon them, which they shall not be able to escape. And though they shall cry unto me, I will not hearken unto them." It's actually very similar to the quote from Watchmen, and the world will look up and shout, "Save us," and I'll whisper no. Which I wouldn't put it past Alan Moore to paraphrase a bit of Jeremiah. I also wouldn't put it past Jordan Peele to maybe paraphrase a little Alan Moore. The ink blots used in the film's advertising are also reminiscent of the character that speaks that line in Watchmen, Rorschach. Rorschach tests are also traditionally symmetrical, continuing the theme of mirroring that's present throughout the movie. Here, though, put it in context, the wider passage speaks of God's encouragement to the sons of Judah to stop worshipping false prophets and God's intention to bring forth a disaster upon those who do. In Us, however, instead of God or Judah, we have Red, saviour of the tethered, who promises to bring violent disaster on humanity. You could even argue she is angry specifically at the false prophet that walks in her place, Adelaide. And critics have seemed to be confused about much of the movie, and specifically the meaning here. I think the closest I've seen is Rosie Fletcher, who posited that the above-ground humans worship the wrong things and are subsequently feeling the wrath. This seems to be mostly correct, but I think the false prophets distinction is key. While the above-grounders are shown to be extremely materialistic, for example, Gabe trying to bribe his way to freedom, Red is not really mad at that. She's mad that they all got to live nice lives while those below suffered, but she's not exactly anti-materialistic. This is the girl that wanted the Thriller t-shirt and based her nationwide protest on an advert she saw. The wrath in the passage belongs to God. The wrath in the movie belongs to Red. God is angry at the worship of false prophets in his place. Red is angry at the false figure that now stands in hers. The metaphor seems pretty clear. One last thing of note is the specific chapter and verse is palindromic, 11:11. I've already mentioned it briefly, but mirroring is a huge recurring theme in the movie. Characters' reflections, characters mimicking each other's movements, certain shots acting as though the camera itself is a mirror, even the central visual motif of the scissors is symmetrical. In fact, if you imagine the shape of the closed scissors, it's two mirrored ovals joined at the bottom symmetrically, two mirror beings linked by the same soul. Obviously, the scissors are also a motif of cutting the tether between them. Even the other repeated visual signifier, the handcuffs worn by Adelaide, they're also symmetrical. Okay, lots to process. I think that's all the explanation done, so to finish up, is there any deeper meaning to the film, or is there anything else the film has to say? So when looking for deeper meaning here, I think the primary question has to be, what or who do the tethered represent? Obviously, once we get into these murky depths, there's no such things as absolutes or definites, and it's all open to interpretation. But I think I've narrowed it down to probably the right answer, a bad answer, and a good answer. So let's start with probably the right answer because it's easily got the broadest fit. Here, the tethered represent the disenfranchised in general, the voiceless, the stepped on, the ignored. Rather than representing a particular group or class, it is rather representative of the state of the disenfranchised, the harm that can come to a person or a group when society leaves them behind. One major factor in this is how they're often demonized and portrayed as the villain by both their opponents and the audience. As we find in real life, and as the audience comes to understand, Red's struggle and her performance, it becomes one of heartbreak and betrayal rather than terror. This type of demonization, or othering as it's known, has sadly been a historical occurrence against many racial groups in America. And that brings me on to the bad theory, that this is a slavery allegory or it is in some way representative of black treatment in America. There is some merit to this theory, and most of that I've already discussed, but other things of note include the uniform outfits of the tethered, the shackling worn by Adelaide, but ultimately I just don't see this theory as accurate. In fact, it seems problematic from the get-go considering the pan-racial populace of the tethered. Lastly, we have the good answer, that the tethered are symbolic of the disenfranchised working or lower classes in America. I'm personally backing this theory mainly because of one key line. When Gabe asks Red, "Who are you people?" Red replies, "We are Americans." Now, when you first hear this, it's terrifying. The preliminary assumption being that she intends to kill you and take your place, and Americans is her demonic understanding of how these people are labeled. We'll become Americans. But once the plight of the tethered is understood, once the disenfranchised are recognized as equal in their humanity, then the phrase takes on a very different meaning. We are Americans and you don't even know we exist. We are Americans and we deserve rights. We are Americans and we will no longer be stepped on for the sake of a privileged ruling class. The tethering provides a link between two people, one happy and successful, the other imprisoned and impoverished in every sense. This serves as a reminder that this situation is far worse than, say, those who walk away from Omelas. This is hyper-capitalist America, and here your success damn near guarantees the failure of someone else, some shadow you'll never meet. We can also bring this back to reflection. The disenfranchised as a Black Mirror counterpart of their exploiters. The natural waste product of excess, those that fall by the wayside. The awful truth is that it wouldn't be success if everyone could achieve it. It would just be the status quo. And one last thing I think provides merit here is that it's the American government who provide the highest antagonist. They seek the unnatural control that creates the tethered in the first place, and they are uncaring about their failures, which fits with this classist reading of the movie. In terms of any further racial commentary, one thing I found interesting was that characters seemed almost disjointed in their reactions to family members being snatched in front of them or split up from the main group. Again, I think this speaks to the Black community in America's harsh acceptance that they're very likely to be the victims of violence, and so are their families. These are nuanced African-American characters, and while the film's subject matter is mostly apart from issues of race, this is firmly a Black movie, and these are characters that are firmly aware of the social and racialized dangers they face. This hopelessness in the face of violence is made even more noticeable by Peele continuing his trend from Get Out of characters actually acting like they've seen horror movies before. They're very aware of the dangers they face, and they act sensibly rather than heroically. One more thing of note on the race front is Jordan Peele's continuing problematization and nuanced depictions of Black masculinities. This is most noticeable when Gabe is first confronted with the family in his driveway, and we see the conflict between the real him and the thuggish persona he attempts to portray. This is amplified further as he sits timidly at the feet of the gargantuan Jeremiah, who is wearing an outfit reminiscent of a prison jumpsuit. Here we're given a tableau of the lived experience of Black masculinity versus the violent caricature that those who seek to demonize Black America would portray. We also see it problematized further as Gabe attempts to get ready for what he hopes to be sexual intercourse with Adelaide, and it's quite a funny scene as he's sort of got his legs either side of the camera and we're at crotch level looking up at him. Now, Gabe is a huge Black man, and Hollywood traditionally not a big fan of this kind of shot or necessarily making Black men seem large and powerful, especially in a sexual way. They usually shy away from it. And here Jordan Peele does it, but it's played for laughs. He's kind of a ridiculous figure. He's not the powerhouse of sexuality that he wants to be. Instead, he looks kind of silly to the audience. And again, it's a problematization of what Black masculinity is versus how people perceive it. Finally, let's quickly examine some other reoccurring motifs in Jordan Peele's work, namely the use of repeated metronome to build and remind of dramatic tension. In Get Out, it was the hypnotic spoon tapping, and in Us, it's the repeated clicking of the flint lighter mechanism. Another thing Jordan Peele seems to find scary is people sprinting at full speed at night. Bonus points if they're sprinting robotically like they'll never tire. Perhaps most importantly though, Peele is very clearly a major cinephile. Influences here range from the Omen series, Nightmare on Elm Street, Jaws, The Goonies, The Shining. The list goes on, and ultimately, as much as this film is about disenfranchisement, it must equally be considered a love letter to the horror genre in general. In fact, I read that after the genre confusion of Get Out, Peele had sought to make something that could more easily be defined and recognised as straight-up horror. I think he obviously succeeded, but at the same time, I think this is only really a horror film the first time you see it. After that, it surely becomes something different. And that's everything for us, for now at least. Thank you so much for listening, and well done if you made it this far. The next videos are still going to be Beyond the Black Rainbow and superhero movies as a response to the 9/11 attacks. Now I've got my new setup, videos should be coming thick and fast, certainly much more frequently than they have done, so make sure to subscribe if any of that sounds interesting to you, and thanks again for watching, guys. Peace.